The Arctic ice is melting, and it will start World War III. The melting frontier. If you knew a single misunderstanding could crash markets and trigger a military scramble before anyone could explain, would you still look away? That's the Arctic now, where tiny moves carry outsized consequences, and your next shipment, paycheck, or power bill depends on what happens above the 70th parallel. The siren starts as a low moan, then climbs. Ice buckles. A Russian icebreaker's bow carves a black ribbon through fog, while a missile drill echoes somewhere beyond the flow line. A Chinese research ship hangs back, instruments awake. Canadian jets bank south of the cloud deck. And far below, a string of American sensors near the Chukchi Sea goes dark one by one. Get this, an ocean that used to be a wall just cracked open into a shortcut that slices weeks off Asia, Europe trade. The map isn't ready, neither are the rules. To understand why every hull here feels like a match near dry tinder, we need to see how the ice gave way and what came rushing in. The environmental catastrophe, the melting ice. First, the door didn't creak, it slammed. In 2007, Arctic summer sea ice plunged beyond anything satellites had seen since the late 1970s. 5 summers later, 2012 buried that record again. This wasn't a gentle shrink, it was a lurch, the kind that forces planners to redraw timelines overnight. Scientists had warned about feedback loops. White ice reflects sunlight, dark ocean swallows it. But seeing them accelerate in real time changed the tone in boardrooms and war rooms at once. Now remember, ice isn't just area, it's thickness. Multi-year ice, the old hard stuff that resists storms, thinned and broke apart, replaced by younger, seasonal ice that melts fast and shifts unpredictably. On satellite maps, the Arctic began to look more like lace than shield. That lace matters. A narrow lead can open for a week, then slam shut with a pressure ridge tall as a house. For insurers and captains, that variability is the difference between a calculated risk and a coin toss. Meanwhile, something else was happening. The melt season stretched. Spring breakup came earlier, autumn freeze-up lagged. A shipping window, once theoretical, blinked open for a few summer weeks, then a few more. The first commercial pilots tiptoed through with icebreaker escorts and contingency fuel stacked high. They weren't chasing hero points. They were testing whether time savings on the route between Shanghai and Rotterdam could beat the cost of escorts, delays, and higher premiums. Some runs shaved 10 to 15 days. That got attention. What nobody knew at the time was how quickly the perception of uninsurable would shift to priceable. Underwriters hate uncertainty, but they love data. Each escorted transit added a line to a model: ice concentration, wind history, hull class, escort response times, SAR coverage. With every season, those models got sharper, even as the ice stayed jumpy. The signal to shippers was subtle but powerful. If you bring the right ship, follow the rules, and pay for teeth up front, the Arctic isn't a myth anymore. But there was one problem. Climate change wasn't just peeling back water, it was moving the goalposts for everything that lives and hunts up here. Indigenous communities found travel routes changing beneath their sleds and skiffs. Sea ice that once anchored a winter trail now fractured without warning. Walrus hauled out on beaches in massive, dangerous clusters. Polar bears wandered towns more often, leaner and bolder. The human risk wasn't abstract. It walked past school windows and along fuel depots. While that played out onshore, offshore storms grew meaner. Open water breeds waves, and waves break ice. The Arctic, once a sound-dampened world of ridges and dull pressure pops, started to sound like the North Atlantic in bad mood. That's tough on hulls and crews. Even ice-class ships don't like beam seas across drifting flows. Captains watched barometers, satellite imagery, and ice charts like hawks, then filed routes that threaded black water, gray slush, and white hazard at uncomfortable margins. Here's where it gets interesting. The melt created opportunity and risk at the same time, and different players weighed those differently. Russia, with ports, nuclear icebreakers, and coastal infrastructure along the Northern Sea route, saw a controlled corridor it could monetize and police. Canada stared at the Northwest Passage, shallower, trickier, and closer to indigenous communities, and saw sovereignty on a thinnest of ice. The United States, with Alaska's coastline and a short icebreaker roster, saw new obligations without matching tools. China saw a future line on a map, a polar silk road that wouldn't run through choke points it didn't control. And the clock kept ticking. In late summer, satellite images showed more blue than white on the central basin. Researchers talked about the probability of ice-free summers by the 203s or 204s, depending on emissions and variability. Ice-free is a shorthand, it still means scraps of flows, but for navigation and politics, scraps can be enough to change behavior. A transpolar route, straight across the top, went from science fiction to a forecast line on shipping slides. The catastrophe isn't just spatial, it's chemical. Warmer, fresher surface layers from meltwater alter currents and nutrient mixing. The Arctic's role as a planetary refrigerator, pushing dense, salty water south that helps drive the global conveyor belt, wobbles under stress. Fisheries shift. Where the patterns far away, jet streams, blocking highs start to behave in ways that snarl crops and power grids thousands of miles from the nearest iceberg. The Arctic isn't a box on the map, it's a lever. In the aftermath of each, warmest on record, season, the same meeting plays out in different capitals. Can we be present without breaking things worse? Crew safety, search and rescue, spill response, and community input sit awkwardly beside route profitability, sanctions exposure, and deterrence. The ice said not yet for centuries. Now it's saying hurry up, and that is its own danger. Because when lanes appear before rules, metal fills the space first. And metal has a way of deciding law after the fact. The science of Arctic collapse, feedback loops, and tipping points. To understand why the Arctic went from shield to sieve so fast, we need to watch the loops tighten. Start with albedo. Bright ice throws sunlight back to space, dark ocean drinks it. Lose a patch of ice, you absorb more heat, which melts more ice, which absorbs still more heat. That's the ice, albedo feedback, simple on paper and ruthless in practice. It doesn't wait politely for policy. Now add the shape of the ice itself. Thinner ice grows faster in winter but breaks earlier in spring. It fractures into mobile flows that drift south into warmer water and vanish. Old multi-year ice, thick, ridged, stubborn, used to survive summer and seed the next winter's freeze. Replace it with fragile first-year ice and you change the season's starting conditions. Each spring begins on weaker footing, and storms don't just bruise the surface, they tear seams open. Meanwhile, ocean heat climbs the ladder. The Atlantic pushes warmer, saltier water into the Barents and Kara seas. The Pacific leaks heat through the Bering Strait. Under the surface, subsurface layers store warmth like a battery. When winds shift or storms churn, that hidden heat rises and hits the underside of the ice. Melt from above and below is a 1-2 that shortens the calendar. It's why the window widened even when winter still showed plenty of white from space. Permafrost enters the story like a sleeping archive thawing too fast. Ground that stayed frozen for millennia starts to slump and weep. As it thaws, microbes wake and chew through ancient plant matter, releasing carbon dioxide and methane. Methane traps far more heat per molecule over short timeframes. It vents from lakes as bubbles, from thawing coasts as plumes. The carbon cycle, once a slow exchange, gets a burst of fast cash, paid in warming. That fuels more thaw, a feedback with teeth. There's another lever, snow. Early snow on sea ice can insulate it from winter cold, slowing growth. Late spring snow affects albedo differently than bare ice. On land, if autumn snow comes before the soil is deeply cold, it can blanket the ground and trap summer heat beneath, encouraging permafrost thaw. Tiny timing shifts stack into big outcomes because thresholds lurk everywhere. Temperatures where salt rejects from freezing water, wind speeds where flows buckle, nutrient pulses that flip ecosystems. Here's the part that reaches into mid-latitudes. As the Arctic warms faster than the rest of the planet, the temperature contrast between pole and equator shrinks. That gradient helps power the jet stream, weaken it, and the jet can wobble, meander, and stall. When it stalls, weather systems linger, drought that won't break, rain that won't stop, heat domes that sit like lids. The Arctic's melt writes patterns on cornfields, river basins, and power grids far away from any buoy. Sea ice isn't the only freezer. The Greenland ice sheet stores enough water to raise global sea level by over 6 meters if completely lost. We aren't there, but surface melt, meltwater lakes, and moulins that drive water to the bed all reduce friction and can speed ice flow to the sea. Freshwater pouring into the North Atlantic lightens surface layers and can slow parts of the Atlantic overturning circulation. Slow that conveyor, and you change storm tracks and sea level along coastlines unevenly, complicating ports and naval planning. Listen to the Arctic Ocean itself. As ice retreats, waves grow, bigger fetch, bigger seas, more mechanical breakup. Those waves erode coasts that once were protected by winter ice, collapsing bluffs and releasing still more carbon from ancient soils. Storm surge creeps into villages and fuel yards. The line between climate system and human logistics blurs when the beach itself moves inland by yards each year. Tipping points aren't a single trapdoor, they're clusters of thresholds. Some are clear, some are sea ice extent that crosses a record low permafrost emissions that flip a regional carbon balance. Others are sneaky, ecosystems shifting from ice algae to open water phytoplankton, changing how food webs function. In each case, past behavior becomes a weak guide. Models improve, but uncertainty widens the risk margin for anyone betting steel, livelihoods, or policy. This is why generals, mayors, and shipowners read the same cryosphere charts. The physics doesn't care about borders. It just adds heat, rearranges timing, and hands us a map that's changing faster than our rules. The opening of the Northern Sea Route, a new global highway. Okay, so here's where things get interesting. You know that feeling when you're about to discover something mind-blowing? Well, imagine trying to explain quantum physics to your cat, but here's the twist. Your cat might actually understand it better than you do. Wild, right? But hold on, because what I'm about to tell you next will completely change how you think about this. The Northern Sea Route didn't just appear overnight. It was always there, frozen solid beneath Russia's northern coast, a ghost highway waiting for its moment. But when the ice started pulling back, something fascinating happened. This wasn't just open water appearing randomly across the Arctic basin. This was a specific, predictable corridor opening up along the Siberian coastline, and Russia was sitting right there with the keys. Get ready for this. The Northern Sea Route isn't some wild frontier passage like the Northwest Passage with its shallow, island-choked channels. This is a relatively deep-water highway that runs from the Bering Strait all the way to the Barents Sea. And here's the crazy part, it cuts the distance between East Asia and Europe by nearly 40% compared to the traditional Suez Canal route. We are talking about shaving 2 to 3 weeks off shipping times. That's not just convenient, that's economy changing. But wait, there's more. Russia didn't just watch this happen passively. They've been building what amounts to a toll road in the Arctic for decades. Their nuclear icebreaker fleet, the largest in the world, isn't just for show. These massive vessels can plow through ice up to 3 meters thick, creating safe passage for commercial ships that would otherwise be trapped. And here's where it gets really strategic. Russia controls who gets escorted, when they get escorted, and how much they pay for the privilege. Plot twist, this isn't just about shipping lanes anymore. The Northern Sea Route has become Russia's economic lifeline and strategic shield all rolled into one. Their massive Arctic LNG projects, like Yamal LNG and the newer Arctic LNG 2, depend entirely on this route to get their product to market. And during winter months, only Russian icebreakers can keep those energy exports flowing. That gives Moscow incredible leverage over global energy markets and sanctions-busting capabilities. Meanwhile, something else was happening that nobody anticipated. The route wasn't just getting longer seasons, it was getting safer and more predictable. Russia invested billions in coastal infrastructure, new ports, emergency response stations, navigation aids, and even military bases along the entire corridor. They've essentially created a managed maritime highway where they set all the rules. Other nations can use it, but they play by Russia's terms. Here's the thing that keeps shipping executives up at night. The Northern Sea Route isn't an international waterway in Russia's eyes. They consider it their historically established national transport artery. That means they claim the right to regulate traffic, charge fees, and even deny passage if they choose. This creates a fascinating standoff with countries like the United States that insist it should be treated as an international strait with free navigation rights. But here's where the story takes another turn. While everyone argues about legal definitions, the commercial reality is already taking shape. Major shipping companies like COSCO and Maersk have been running trial voyages through the route, carefully navigating both the physical ice and the political currents. They're building the data, the relationships, and the operational experience that will define Arctic shipping for decades to come. The real game changer, Russia's development of the route isn't slowing down. They're planning year-round navigation capabilities by 2030, which would transform global shipping patterns permanently. And with climate models showing the Arctic continuing to warm, the window for navigation keeps widening each year. What started as a seasonal shortcut is rapidly becoming a permanent fixture on the world's maritime map. But here's the catch, and this is where things get really tense. As more ships use the Northern Sea route, the potential for accidents, environmental disasters, and military incidents grows exponentially. A single oil spill in these fragile waters could be catastrophic. A collision between vessels from rival nations could spark an international crisis, and every ship that passes through strengthens Russia's claim to control this new global highway. The Northern Sea route isn't just open water, it's the front line of a new kind of geopolitical competition, one where commercial shipping, energy exports, military strategy, and climate change all collide in a space that was once too frozen to matter. And the rules of this new game are being written right now, ship by ship, season by season. The economic prize, untapped resources. But here's where it gets really interesting. While everyone was watching the shipping lanes open up, something else was happening beneath the surface, literally. The Arctic isn't just becoming a shortcut between continents, it's sitting on what might be the last great untapped treasure trove of natural resources on the planet, and the numbers are staggering. Get this, the United States Geological Survey estimates the Arctic could hold nearly a quarter of the world's undiscovered oil and gas reserves. We're talking about 90 billion barrels of oil and 1,670 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. That's enough to power entire nations for decades. But here's the twist. Most of these resources aren't evenly distributed. About 84% of the estimated resources are expected to occur offshore, and the vast majority lie within what Russia already claims as its exclusive economic zone. Now wait, there's more. It's not just about oil and gas. The Arctic holds something even more crucial for the 21st century: critical minerals. Greenland's melting ice sheet is revealing deposits of rare earth elements, nickel, cobalt, and platinum group metals, the very minerals that power everything from smartphones to electric vehicle batteries to military technology. China currently dominates the global supply chain for these minerals, controlling over 80% of rare earth processing. The Arctic represents a potential game changer for breaking that monopoly. But here's the crazy part: accessing these resources is becoming possible precisely because of the same climate change that makes their extraction so environmentally risky. The same melting ice that opens shipping lanes also reduces the sea ice that once made offshore drilling impossibly dangerous. It's a vicious circle. Climate change enables resource extraction that, when burned, accelerates more climate change. Plot twist: Russia isn't just sitting on these resources, they're already cashing in. Their Yamal LNG project in the Russian Arctic is one of the largest liquefied natural gas facilities in the world, and it's shipping product year-round through the Northern Sea route. Then there's Arctic LNG 2, an even bigger project that's facing sanctions but still moving forward with Chinese partners. These aren't speculative ventures, they're multi-billion-dollar operations that are already reshaping global energy markets. Meanwhile, something else was happening that few people anticipated. The mineral rush in Greenland is creating its own geopolitical drama. As the ice retreats, mining companies from China, Australia, Canada, and Europe are scrambling for exploration licenses. But here's where it gets really tense. Greenland is technically part of Denmark, but it has home rule and dreams of full independence. The problem: Greenland's economy depends heavily on Danish subsidies, and mining revenue could be their ticket to sovereignty. Wait, there's a catch. Mining in the Arctic isn't like mining anywhere else. The environmental risks are enormous. A single oil spill in these icy waters could persist for decades, destroying fragile ecosystems that indigenous communities depend on for survival. Mining operations could contaminate water supplies and disrupt traditional hunting grounds. The very people who have lived in the Arctic for millennia could see their way of life destroyed by the rush for resources beneath their feet. Here's the thing that makes this resource grab so dangerous. Unlike the shipping lanes where there's at least some framework for international cooperation, resource extraction is fundamentally about national sovereignty. When a country discovers oil or minerals in its exclusive economic zone, it has the right to develop them. But in the Arctic, those EEZ boundaries are still disputed in many areas, and the environmental consequences don't respect national borders. The stakes are incredibly high. For Russia, Arctic resources represent a way to maintain economic power despite sanctions and declining production elsewhere. For China, they offer a path to resource security and reduce dependence on unstable supply chains. For the United States and its allies, they represent both an economic opportunity and a strategic vulnerability if adversaries control these critical resources. But here's where the story takes another turn. The economics of Arctic resource extraction are brutally challenging. Even with melting ice, operating in the Arctic is exponentially more expensive than conventional projects. Companies need specialized equipment, higher wages for workers, and massive insurance coverage. Oil prices need to stay high to justify the investment, and the world is supposedly transitioning away from fossil fuels. Yet the lure is irresistible. As conventional resources dwindle and demand for critical minerals skyrockets, the calculus keeps shifting. What seems uneconomical today might be essential tomorrow. And that's why companies and countries are making huge bets now, not because the resources are cheap to extract, but because controlling them might be crucial for future economic and military dominance. The real prize isn't just the resources themselves, it's the strategic leverage they provide. The country that controls Arctic energy resources can influence global markets. The country that dominates Arctic mineral supplies can lead the clean technology revolution. And the country that masters Arctic operations can project power in a region that's becoming increasingly central to global affairs. What we're witnessing is a slow-motion resource grab playing out across the top of the world. It's not happening with dramatic land rushes or gold fever. It's happening through quiet exploration licenses, strategic investments, and patient infrastructure building. But beneath the surface, the competition is intensifying every day as the ice continues its retreat. Oil, gas, and minerals, the trillions beneath the ice. But here's where the story takes a deeper dive, literally. While the world watches the surface drama of shipping lanes, the real jackpot lies kilometers below the seabed and buried under melting permafrost. The USGS numbers we mentioned earlier, those 90 billion barrels of oil, are just the beginning of the story. Because the real value isn't in the volume alone, it's in the timing. The world is supposedly transitioning to green energy, right? But here's the plot twist. That transition requires minerals that mostly come from, you guessed it, places like the Arctic. Get ready for this. The very technology meant to save us from fossil fuels needs a massive infusion of metals that are concentrated in the far north. Electric vehicle batteries need cobalt, lithium, and nickel. Wind turbines need rare earth elements for their powerful magnets. Solar panels need tellurium and indium. And guess where some of the largest untapped deposits of these critical minerals are located? Greenland's melting ice cap is revealing geological formations that geologists have been dreaming about for decades. But here's the catch. Mining these minerals creates its own environmental nightmare, creating a paradox where saving the planet might require destroying one of its last pristine ecosystems. Meanwhile, something else was happening that changes the entire resource equation. It's not just about what's there, it's about who can get to it first and cheapest. Russia's Arctic coastline isn't just long, it's geologically blessed. The Kara Sea and Barents Sea shelves are believed to hold reserves that could replace their declining fields in western Siberia. And unlike international waters where ownership is disputed, these are clearly within Russia's exclusive economic zone. That gives them a huge head start in the race to monetize the melting. But wait, there's more. The technology for Arctic resource extraction has been advancing faster than anyone predicted. Offshore drilling platforms now come with ice-resistant designs that can withstand moving ice flows. Subsea production systems can operate in deep water without a surface platform, and automated mining equipment can operate in extreme conditions with minimal human presence. What was technically impossible a generation ago is now just expensive. And when oil prices spike or mineral demand soars, expensive suddenly becomes worth it. Here's where it gets really strategic. Control over these resources isn't just about money, it's about leverage. The country that dominates Arctic energy exports can influence global prices and political alliances. The country that controls critical mineral supplies can dictate the pace of the green transition. We're not just talking about economic advantage here, we're talking about the ability to shape the entire 21st century global order. And that's why the quiet, patient resource mapping happening right now might be more important than any military exercise. Plot twist, the environmental risks of Arctic resource extraction are on a completely different scale than anywhere else. An oil spill in the icy waters of the Chukchi Sea wouldn't behave like the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the warm Gulf of Mexico. In the Arctic, oil breaks down much more slowly. It can get trapped under ice and travel for hundreds of kilometers before surfacing months later. Cleanup operations would be nearly impossible during the long winter darkness. A single major spill could effectively poison an entire sea for generations. But here's the thing that keeps energy executives up at night. The insurance industry is watching this risk calculus very carefully. Lloyd's of London and other major insurers have been running scenarios on Arctic disasters, and the numbers are terrifying. The combination of remote locations, extreme weather, and fragile ecosystems creates liability exposures that could bankrupt even the largest companies. That's why many shipping and energy companies are proceeding cautiously, not because they can't technically do it, but because they might not be able to afford the consequences if something goes wrong. Meanwhile, indigenous communities find themselves caught in the middle of this resource rush. Their ancestral lands sit atop potential mineral wealth that could fund their independence or destroy their way of life. In Greenland, the debate over uranium mining has divided communities between those who see mining as their ticket to full independence from Denmark and those who fear the environmental and cultural costs. Similar tensions are playing out in Alaska and northern Canada, where resource development promises jobs and revenue but threatens traditional hunting and fishing grounds. Real game changer, though, might be something most people haven't considered: methane hydrates. Buried in Arctic permafrost and under the seabed are vast quantities of methane trapped in ice-like structures. If commercially viable extraction techniques are developed, methane hydrates could represent an energy source larger than all the world's conventional natural gas reserves combined. The problem: releasing methane, a potent greenhouse gas, during extraction could accelerate climate change even faster. It's the ultimate energy paradox, tapping one climate problem to solve another. What we're witnessing is a slow-motion resource revolution that's following the retreating ice. The companies and countries that position themselves now through exploration licenses, infrastructure investment, and technological development will likely dominate the next century of resource extraction. And unlike the shipping lanes where multiple players can theoretically coexist, resource control is often winner-take-all. The Arctic isn't just melting, it's becoming the ultimate strategic prize in the race for what lies beneath. Fishing rights and biological wealth, the new cold rush. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. While everyone's focused on oil tankers and mineral deposits, there's another resource rush happening in the newly open waters, and it's creating conflicts that could spark confrontations faster than any drilling rig dispute. The Arctic Ocean isn't just empty blue space. It's one of the most biologically productive marine environments on the planet, and as the ice retreats, fishing grounds are opening up that haven't been accessible since before recorded history. Get this, the same warm water currents that are melting the ice are also bringing nutrient-rich waters further north, creating new feeding grounds for fish stocks that are being pushed poleward by warming oceans. Species like cod, capelin, and halibut are moving into areas that were once too cold and ice-covered to support large populations. Commercial fishing fleets from as far away as China, South Korea, and the European Union are already positioning themselves to exploit these new fisheries. But here's the catch: nobody really knows who has the right to fish where, because the existing international agreements weren't written for an ocean that's literally changing shape season by season. Meanwhile, something else was happening that makes this fishing rush particularly dangerous. Unlike oil and mineral rights, which are generally tied to seabed claims under international law, fishing rights in the high seas, the areas beyond national exclusive economic zones, are governed by a patchwork of regional agreements that simply don't exist yet for the Central Arctic Ocean. That means we're looking at a potential free-for-all in international waters that could quickly deplete fish stocks before proper management can be established. But wait, there's more. The fishing industry isn't waiting for diplomats to figure this out. Factory ships equipped with advanced sonar and processing capabilities are already making exploratory voyages into the newly ice-free areas during the summer months. These vessels can stay at sea for months, processing their catch on board and transferring it to transport ships without ever needing to dock. That makes monitoring and regulation incredibly difficult, especially in the vast, remote reaches of the Arctic Ocean, where surveillance is sparse and enforcement nearly impossible. Plot twist, the country with the most to lose from unregulated fishing might be Russia, despite their dominant position in other Arctic sectors. Russia's northern coastal communities depend heavily on fisheries for both subsistence and commercial purposes. As fish stocks move northward into international waters, Russian fishermen could find themselves competing with massive international fleets that have greater range and processing capacity. That creates a powerful incentive for Moscow to assert control over fishing grounds well beyond what international law might normally allow. Here's where it gets really tense. In 2018, 9 nations and the European Union did sign a historic agreement to prevent unregulated commercial fishing in the high seas portion of the Central Arctic Ocean. The signatories, including the United States, Russia, China, Canada, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Japan, and South Korea, agreed not to fish in the area until better scientific understanding of the ecosystem exists. But here's the problem. That agreement is voluntary, temporary, and doesn't cover the increasingly accessible waters within national EEZs that are seeing the most dramatic ecological changes. Meanwhile, indigenous communities are watching this fishing rush with growing alarm. For generations, Arctic peoples have relied on marine resources as a primary food source, and their traditional knowledge about fish migrations and breeding grounds is being rendered obsolete by rapid environmental changes. Commercial fishing vessels operating near coastal communities can disrupt local subsistence fishing, damage sensitive marine habitats, and introduce competition for species that were once reliably available. The conflict between industrial-scale fishing and traditional subsistence practices is creating tensions that could easily spill over into international incidents. But here's the thing that makes this biological wealth so strategically important: food security. As climate change disrupts agriculture and fisheries in lower latitudes, the Arctic's emerging productivity could become crucial for feeding populations in nations facing food shortages. China, with its massive population and limited arable land per capita, has identified Arctic fisheries as a potential long-term food security solution. Their distant water fishing fleet, already the largest in the world, is increasingly active in Arctic waters, often operating in legal gray zones that test the boundaries of national jurisdictions. The real danger isn't just overfishing, it's the precedent being set right now. Every vessel that fishes in disputed waters without challenge strengthens the case for historic use claims that could later be used to justify permanent access. Every nation that fails to protect its coastal fisheries from foreign fleets risks setting a pattern of acquiescence that will be difficult to reverse. We are witnessing the creation of fishing patterns and territorial claims that could define Arctic governance for generations, all happening below the radar while attention focuses on flashier resource conflicts. What makes this biological rush different from the mineral and energy competitions is its immediacy. Fishing vessels can deploy quickly, operate with minimal infrastructure, and generate returns within a single season. That means the rules of the new Arctic are being written not in diplomatic conferences, but by fishing captains making daily decisions about where to drop their nets. And in the absence of clear boundaries and enforcement, those decisions could easily lead to the kind of confrontations that start with fishing nets and end with naval vessels. The geopolitical players and their claims. Okay, so here's where things get interesting. You know that feeling when you're about to discover something mind-blowing? Well, imagine three superpowers arriving at a newly opened frontier with completely different rulebooks, and each convinced they're holding the only valid map. That's exactly what's happening in the Arctic right now, and the legal foundations they're building on are as shaky as the melting permafrost beneath their feet. Get this, the entire framework for who owns what in the Arctic rests on a treaty called UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. But here's the twist. The United States, one of the key Arctic powers, has never actually ratified it. They follow most of its provisions as customary international law, but that creates a fascinating paradox where America champions freedom of navigation principles from a treaty it technically hasn't joined. Meanwhile, Russia and Canada have used UNCLOS to make massive continental shelf claims that could extend their resource rights hundreds of miles beyond their coastlines. But wait, there's more. The most dramatic legal showdown is happening over those shipping lanes we discussed earlier. Canada considers the Northwest Passage to be its internal waters, meaning they have full sovereignty and can control who enters. Their argument rests on historic usage and the unique geography of the archipelago. But here's where it gets crazy. The United States and most European nations view it as an international strait where freedom of navigation applies. This isn't just academic. It's about who gets to set the rules for rescue, pollution control, and military passage. Plot twist, Russia takes a similar approach with the Northern Sea route, but with a crucial difference. They don't claim it as internal waters. Instead, they argue it's a historically established national transport artery that gives them special regulatory powers. This clever framing allows them to charge fees, require icebreaker escorts, and control traffic while avoiding the sovereignty debate that Canada faces. It's a masterclass in creating facts on the water while the legal debates continue ashore. Meanwhile, something else was happening that could change everything. The race to file extended continental shelf claims. Under UNCLOS, countries can claim seabed rights beyond their 200-mile exclusive economic zones if they can prove their continental shelf extends further. Russia filed first in 2001, making a bold claim to nearly half the Arctic Ocean. Canada and Denmark have since filed competing claims, with Denmark arguing that the Lomonosov Ridge, an underwater mountain range, is actually an extension of Greenland. These claims overlap in key areas, creating potential flashpoints where resource extraction could trigger disputes. But here's the thing that keeps diplomats up at night. The legal ambiguity isn't a bug, it's a feature for some players. Russia has used the uncertainty to steadily expand its physical presence while legal debates drag on for years. Their strategy is simple: establish control through icebreakers, military bases, and infrastructure, then argue that practice has created new norms. It's the maritime equivalent of possession is 9/10 of the law, and it's working. Now get ready for this. China's approach is even more innovative. As a self-declared near-Arctic state, they're creating a whole new category of Arctic involvement without making traditional territorial claims. Their strategy focuses on scientific research, commercial investment, and infrastructure partnerships that give them influence without the baggage of sovereignty disputes. It's a patient, long-game approach that recognizes that in the 21st century, economic presence often matters more than legal ownership. Here's where the story takes another turn. Indigenous communities are emerging as crucial legal stakeholders with rights that predate any of these national claims. Through land claims agreements and international recognition of Indigenous rights, groups like the Inuit Circumpolar Council are asserting their role in Arctic governance. Their traditional knowledge about ice conditions, wildlife patterns, and sustainable resource use is gaining legal weight, just as the great powers are realizing they need local cooperation to operate effectively in this challenging environment. But wait, there's a catch. Military activity adds another layer of complexity to these legal debates. While UNCLOS provides some guidance on naval passage, much depends on how waters are classified. If the Northwest Passage is considered internal waters, Canada could potentially restrict military vessels. If it's an international strait, warships would have broader transit rights. This uncertainty creates perfect conditions for testing boundaries, literally. We've already seen incidents where military vessels from different nations interpret the rules differently in real time. The real danger isn't that the legal framework is weak, it's that different players are operating under completely different interpretations simultaneously. A Russian icebreaker escort sees itself as providing a necessary service in waters where Russia has regulatory authority. A US Navy vessel sees itself as asserting freedom of navigation in international waters. A Canadian patrol boat sees itself as defending sovereignty in domestic territory. When these perspectives collide in remote, harsh conditions, the results can escalate faster than any diplomat can respond. What we're witnessing is the creation of Arctic law in real time, not through courtroom decisions, but through the daily actions of ships, planes, and resource companies. Every transit, every drilling operation, every fishing voyage is setting precedents that will shape the region's future governance. The countries that understand this are playing the long game, building their cases through persistent presence and incremental claims. The ones waiting for clear rules may find that by the time the rules are written, the game has already been won. Russia's Arctic fortress, the first mover advantage. But here's where the story takes a decisive turn. While other nations were debating climate science and legal frameworks, Russia was building something extraordinary across its Arctic coastline. They weren't just making claims on paper, they were creating facts on the ground, and more importantly, on the ice. Their strategy was simple but brilliant, become so indispensable to Arctic operations that challenging their presence becomes practically impossible. Get this, Russia's nuclear icebreaker fleet isn't just larger than anyone else's. It's in a completely different category. While the United States struggles to keep its single heavy icebreaker operational, Russia has 7 nuclear-powered icebreakers already sailing, with 3 more massive, Project 22,220 vessels coming online and even bigger, leader-class icebreakers planned. These aren't just ships, they're mobile infrastructure that can carve highways through ice up to 3 meters thick. And here's the twist, they don't just serve Russian interests, they escort Chinese, European, and even occasional American commercial vessels through the Northern Sea route. That creates a fascinating dependency where nations that might oppose Russia's broader Arctic ambitions still need their icebreaking services to move goods efficiently. Meanwhile, something else was happening along Russia's Arctic coast that most of the world missed. Dozens of Soviet-era military bases that were abandoned after the Cold War are being reopened and modernized. Places like Nagaskoye Air Base on Alexandra Land, just 1,000 kilometers from the North Pole, now host runway extensions capable of handling strategic bombers, advanced radar systems, and S-400 missile defense batteries. These installations aren't just symbolic. They create overlapping fields of surveillance and control that make the Northern Sea route one of the most monitored waterways on Earth. But wait, there's more. Russia's Northern Fleet, based near Murmansk, is undergoing its most significant upgrade since the Soviet era. New nuclear-powered submarines specifically designed for Arctic operations are entering service, equipped with advanced sensors and weapon systems optimized for under-ice warfare. Their Bore-class ballistic missile submarines represent the core of Russia's second strike capability, the ability to retaliate after a nuclear attack. And here's where it gets strategic. The Arctic's complex underwater geography provides perfect hiding spots for these submarines, making them incredibly difficult to detect and track. Plot twist, Russia's military buildup isn't just about projecting power, it's about creating what they call an Arctic bastion. This concept involves using the region's natural defenses, thick ice, extreme weather, and remote locations to protect their strategic assets. By controlling the airspace, surface waters, and underwater approaches, Russia aims to create a sanctuary where their most valuable military capabilities can operate without interference. For NATO planners, This creates a nightmare scenario where challenging Russian actions in the Arctic could potentially escalate to nuclear confrontation. Here's the thing that makes Russia's first-mover advantage so formidable. They've been thinking about the Arctic in strategic terms for generations. While Western attention wandered after the Cold War, Russia never really left. Their icebreaker fleet continued operating, their northern communities maintained infrastructure, and their military never fully abandoned Arctic training and preparedness. When climate change began opening the region, they were perfectly positioned to capitalize on it, while others were still waking up to the opportunity. But here's where the story takes another turn. Russia's Arctic strategy isn't just military, it's deeply economic. Their control of the Northern Sea route gives them leverage over global shipping patterns, but their energy projects in the Arctic are even more significant. The Yamal LNG facility, which we mentioned earlier, is just the beginning. They're developing massive new oil and gas fields in the Kara Sea and planning additional LNG terminals along their northern coast. These projects require year-round icebreaker support, specialized Arctic-class tankers, and port infrastructure that simply doesn't exist elsewhere. By mastering these technologies first, Russia isn't just extracting resources, they're setting the standards that others will have to follow. The real genius of Russia's approach is how they've integrated commercial and military presence. Their new Arctic bases often serve dual purposes, supporting both military operations and civilian infrastructure projects. Icebreakers that escort commercial vessels during summer months can support military logistics during exercises. Port facilities built for energy exports can host naval vessels when needed. This integration makes it difficult for other nations to challenge one aspect of Russia's presence without affecting others, creating a holistic system of control that's remarkably resilient. What we are witnessing is the creation of a 21st century version of the Great Game, but played on ice rather than in mountain passes. Russia's decades of preparation, geographic advantages, and strategic patience have given them a head start that will be incredibly difficult to overcome. While other nations debate budgets and environmental concerns, Russia is methodically turning the Arctic into a fortress, not with walls and moats, but with icebreakers, missiles, and infrastructure that make their presence both indispensable and unassailable. The US and NATO response, reasserting presence and deterrence. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States was facing a strategic dilemma that military planners hadn't seriously considered since the Cold War. While Russia was building an Arctic fortress, America's Arctic capabilities had atrophied. Their entire heavy icebreaker fleet consisted of one aging vessel, the Polar Star, which seemed to spend more time in repair docks than in the ice. The Coast Guard's Polar Security Cutter program, meant to deliver new icebreakers, was facing years of delays and ballooning costs. This wasn't just an equipment gap, it was a fundamental mismatch between strategic ambition and practical capability. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. The US response wasn't just about building more icebreakers, it was about leveraging what they did have in abundance: submarine technology. American attack submarines have been operating under the Arctic ice for decades, honing skills that few other nations can match. While surface ships struggle with ice conditions, submarines can navigate beneath it, gathering intelligence, testing sensors, and maintaining a stealthy presence that complicates any adversary's plans. This underwater advantage became America's asymmetric answer to Russia's surface dominance. Plot twist: NATO's approach to the Arctic has been complicated by the very different priorities of its member states. Norway, with its long Arctic coastline and border with Russia, views the region with urgent concern. Canada focuses on sovereignty protection in the Northwest Passage. Meanwhile, Southern European members often see Arctic security as a distant issue. This divergence creates challenges for developing a coherent alliance strategy. But here's where things get interesting. The accession of Finland and Sweden into NATO changes the calculus dramatically. Suddenly, the alliance has two additional Arctic nations with modern militaries and decades of experience operating in extreme cold weather conditions. The US strategy has evolved into a multi-layered approach that acknowledges they can't match Russia's Icebreaker for Icebreaker. Instead, they're focusing on presence through other means: increased surveillance flights by P-8 Poseidon aircraft, expanded military exercises with Arctic allies, and strategic investments in Alaska's infrastructure. The plan to build a deepwater port in Nome, Alaska, once completed, would give the US Navy its first permanent Arctic foothold, a crucial logistics hub for operations in the increasingly accessible waters. Wait, there's more. The real game changer might be happening in the realm of technology rather than traditional military hardware. The US is investing heavily in autonomous systems capable of operating in Arctic conditions, unmanned underwater vehicles that can map seabeds and monitor submarine activity, drones that can survive extreme cold to provide persistent surveillance, and satellite constellations designed specifically for high-latitude communications. These technologies could allow the US to maintain situational awareness across vast Arctic areas without risking expensive manned platforms or provoking direct confrontations. Here's where the diplomatic dance gets really delicate. The US continues to conduct freedom of navigation operations, FONOPS, near disputed areas, sending naval vessels through waters that other nations claim as territorial. These operations serve as statements of principle, asserting that the US does not recognize excessive maritime claims. But they're carefully calibrated to avoid escalation, often timed with diplomatic outreach and framed as routine exercises rather than provocations. It's a balancing act between demonstrating capability and preventing misunderstandings that could spiral out of control. Meanwhile, something else was happening that reflects the new reality of Arctic competition. NATO has been gradually increasing its Arctic exercise tempo, with operations like Cold Response in Norway bringing together thousands of troops from multiple nations to practice cold weather warfare and crisis response. These exercises serve dual purposes. They improve interoperability among allied forces while sending a clear message about NATO's commitment to defending its northern flank. But they're also carefully managed to avoid appearing overly aggressive, with transparency measures designed to prevent miscalculation. The real challenge for the US and NATO isn't just matching Russia's Arctic capabilities. It's doing so in a way that doesn't trigger the very conflict they're trying to prevent. Every military deployment, every exercise, every infrastructure project is watched closely by Moscow and could be misinterpreted as preparation for offensive operations rather than defensive preparedness. This creates a paradox where demonstrating deterrence requires showing capability, but showing too much capability could be seen as provocation. What makes this balancing act even more complex is the commercial dimension. American companies want access to Arctic shipping routes and resources, but they operate under sanctions regimes that complicate dealings with Russian entities. The US government finds itself simultaneously trying to constrain Russia's Arctic ambitions through economic pressure while ensuring American businesses aren't permanently locked out of the region's economic opportunities. It's a strategic tightrope walk with no easy answers. The emerging US and NATO strategy appears to be one of persistent engagement rather than dramatic confrontation. Instead of trying to match Russia's Icebreaker fleet ship for ship, they're building partnerships, developing niche capabilities, and maintaining just enough presence to ensure the Arctic doesn't become a Russian lake. It's a patient, long-term approach that recognizes that climate change is reshaping the region gradually, and the competition will be measured in decades rather than years. But the question remains whether this measured response will be enough to counter Russia's first-mover advantage as the ice continues its retreat. Canada and the Northwest Passage, sovereignty disputes. But here's where the story takes a sharp turn south, from Russia's heavily fortified Northern Sea route to Canada's much more complicated and contentious backyard. While Russia controls its Arctic corridor with icebreakers and missiles, Canada faces a sovereignty challenge that's fundamentally different and in many ways more diplomatically explosive. The Northwest Passage isn't a clean coastal highway like Russia's route. It's a labyrinth of islands, shallow channels, and unpredictable ice conditions that weave through Canada's Arctic archipelago. And this geographical complexity creates a legal nightmare that could trigger confrontations with America, Canada's closest ally. Get this, Canada's position is that the Northwest Passage constitutes its internal waters, meaning they have full sovereignty just like they would over lakes or rivers within their borders. Their argument rests on two pillars. First, that the channels are so intertwined with Canadian territory that they can't realistically be separated from it. And second, that Canada has historically exercised control through Inuit use, mapping, and administration. But here's where it gets crazy. The United States, along with most European nations, views the passage as an international strait, subject to freedom of navigation principles. This isn't just an academic debate, it's about who gets to decide everything from environmental regulations to military access. Plot twist, the legal ambiguity creates a perfect storm of risks. If a commercial vessel transits without Canadian permission and something goes wrong, an oil spill, a grounding, a search and rescue emergency, who has jurisdiction? Canada would argue they're responsible, but the shipping company might look to their flag state for protection. Meanwhile, Indigenous communities along the route find themselves caught between asserting their own sovereignty and relying on Canadian authorities for protection and services. It's a layered sovereignty dispute where multiple claims overlap in the same narrow channels. Meanwhile, something else was happening that makes Canada's position increasingly precarious. As the ice retreats, the channels that were once too dangerous for most commercial traffic are becoming more navigable each year. What was once a theoretical debate is becoming a practical reality as shipping companies begin eyeing the Northwest Passage as a potential alternative to Russia's toll road. The first test came in 2013 when the Nordic Orion became the first bulk carrier to transit the passage, followed by cruise ships carrying tourists through waters that were previously the domain of icebreakers and local hunters. But wait, there's more. Canada's response has been a careful balancing act between asserting sovereignty and avoiding direct confrontation. They've invested in new Arctic patrol vessels, the Harry de Wolf-class ships, that can operate in first-year ice and provide a persistent presence in the region. They've established the Nanisivik Naval Facility as a forward operating base, though its capabilities remain limited. And they've dramatically increased surveillance through satellite monitoring, aerial patrols, and community-based observation programs that leverage Indigenous knowledge of the changing environment. Here's where it gets really tense. The United States has consistently challenged Canada's position through freedom of navigation operations, sending Coast Guard cutters and occasionally naval vessels through the passage without seeking permission. These transits are carefully planned to avoid escalation. They're announced in advance, conducted professionally, and framed as exercises rather than provocations. But each one reinforces the American position that the passage is international waters, gradually eroding Canada's claim through repeated practice. It's a slow-motion sovereignty erosion happening right under Canada's nose. The real danger isn't just about commercial shipping, it's about military access. If the Northwest Passage is considered an international strait, then warships from any nation could theoretically transit without notification or permission. For Canada, this creates an unacceptable security vulnerability along its northern flank. For the United States, it represents crucial strategic flexibility for moving naval assets between the Atlantic and Pacific without depending on Russian-controlled routes or the Panama Canal. This fundamental difference in security perspectives creates friction between two allies who otherwise cooperate closely on continental defense. But here's the thing that makes this dispute so uniquely challenging. Climate change is literally reshaping the battlefield. Channels that were reliably ice-covered for most of the year are now opening for longer seasons. Routes that were once considered impassable are becoming viable with the right ice-class vessels. The very geography that Canada uses to support its internal waters argument, the interconnectedness of the channels with Canadian territory, is being transformed by melting ice. Each passing year makes the passage more accessible, intensifying the sovereignty debate rather than resolving it. What we're witnessing is a classic case of legal principles colliding with changing realities. The rules governing international straits were written for places like the Strait of Hormuz or the Strait of Malacca, narrow passages connecting open oceans. The Northwest Passage, with its complex archipelago geography, doesn't fit neatly into existing categories. This ambiguity creates opportunity for those who want to test boundaries and anxiety for those trying to maintain control. And as more ships venture into these waters, the precedents being set today could determine who controls this strategic corridor for generations to come. The role of non-Arctic states, China's Polar Silk Road. But here's where the story takes its most unexpected turn. While Russia builds fortresses and America plays catch-up, there's a third player rewriting the rulebook entirely. China calls itself a near-Arctic state, which is a fascinating piece of linguistic innovation since Beijing sits at the same latitude as Philadelphia. Their approach isn't about planting flags or making dramatic sovereignty claims. Instead, they're playing the longest game of all, building influence through commerce, science, and infrastructure so gradually that by the time other nations notice what's happening, Chinese presence will feel inevitable. Get this, China's strategy centers on what they call the Polar Silk Road, a deliberate echo of their Belt and Road initiative, but aimed squarely at the top of the world. They're not demanding territory, they're creating dependencies. Their icebreaker, the Zhulong 2, may not be nuclear-powered like Russia's fleet, but it's state-of-the-art and constantly conducting scientific research that just happens to map seabeds, monitor underwater acoustics, and test communications in conditions that would be crucial for military operations. Meanwhile, Chinese companies are quietly acquiring stakes in Arctic energy projects, port facilities, and mining operations, building the economic relationships that will give them leverage long after the ice is gone. Plot twist, China's most brilliant move might be their patient courtship of Russia. While Western sanctions have isolated Moscow from many international partners, Chinese investment has flowed into Russia's Arctic energy projects like Yamal LNG and Arctic LNG 2. This creates a fascinating symbiosis. Russia provides the territory and resources, China provides the capital and market access. But here's the catch. With each investment, China gains not just economic returns, but operational experience, political influence, and strategic positioning that would be impossible to achieve through direct confrontation. They're essentially buying their way into the Arctic through the back door. Meanwhile, something else was happening that demonstrates China's particular genius for Arctic strategy. While everyone focuses on the high-profile shipping routes, Chinese researchers have been methodically studying the transpolar route, the direct path across the central Arctic basin that could bypass both Russia's Northern Sea route and Canada's Northwest Passage entirely. This route won't be viable for decades, but when it opens, the nation that understands its currents, ice patterns, and navigation challenges will have a decisive advantage. China isn't just planning for the Arctic as it exists today, they're preparing for the Arctic of 2050. But wait, there's more. China's scientific presence in the Arctic is both legitimate and strategically brilliant. Their research station in Iceland, the Arctic Science Observatory, collects atmospheric data that's valuable for climate modeling. Their Yellow River station in Norway's Svalbard archipelago studies auroral physics. Their involvement in the Arctic Council as an observer state gives them a seat at the table without the baggage of territorial disputes. Each scientific collaboration builds relationships, gathers data, and establishes China as a responsible Arctic stakeholder, all while their commercial and strategic interests quietly advance. Here's where it gets really interesting. China's dual-use technology approach blurs the line between civilian and military applications in ways that keep other nations guessing. Their satellite constellations provide commercial imagery, but also surveillance capabilities. Their underwater drones map marine life habitats, but also seabed topography crucial for submarine operations. Their ice-capable vessels conduct legitimate research while testing equipment that could support future naval operations. This ambiguity allows China to develop Arctic capabilities while maintaining plausible deniability about any military intentions. The real game changer, though, might be China's focus on setting technical standards rather than political boundaries. As the Arctic opens, someone will decide what constitutes an Arctic-class vessel, what safety protocols govern Arctic shipping, what environmental standards apply to Arctic resource extraction. China is positioning itself to influence these standards through its growing commercial presence, its scientific contributions, and its manufacturing dominance in shipbuilding and Arctic equipment. Control the standards, and you indirectly control access, a much subtler form of power than waving flags or deploying warships. What makes China's approach so effective is its patience. They're not rushing to confront other Arctic powers or make dramatic claims. Instead, they're building relationships, gathering data, making investments, and developing capabilities that will pay off over decades. While Russia and NATO focus on military positioning and the United States struggles with icebreaker procurement, China is quietly becoming indispensable to the Arctic's economic development. And in the 21st century, economic presence often translates into political influence more effectively than military presence ever could. The Polar Silk Road isn't a single route or project. It's a comprehensive strategy to ensure that when the Arctic truly opens, China will have the knowledge, relationships, and infrastructure to shape its future. They're playing chess while others play checkers, thinking in terms of generations rather than election cycles. And as the ice continues its retreat, this patient, methodical approach may prove more decisive than any fleet of icebreakers or military bases. Because in the new Arctic, influence isn't always about who controls the territory, it's about who controls the rules of the game. The legal and diplomatic battlefield. But here's where the story takes a crucial turn. While ships navigate newly open waters and companies eye resources beneath the ice, diplomats are fighting a parallel battle in conference rooms and legal chambers that could determine whether the Arctic becomes a zone of cooperation or confrontation. The problem isn't just that the rules are unclear, it's that the rulebook itself was written for a world where the Arctic remained frozen, and now every nation is interpreting those rules to their maximum advantage. Get this, the entire legal framework rests on the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, but here's the twist. The United States has never actually ratified it. They follow most of its provisions as customary international law, but that creates a fascinating paradox where America champions freedom of navigation principles from a treaty it technically hasn't joined. This gives their diplomatic position a certain flexibility, but it also undermines their credibility when challenging other nations' interpretations. Meanwhile, Russia and Canada have used UNCLOS to make massive continental shelf claims that could extend their resource rights hundreds of miles beyond their coastlines, creating overlapping claims that diplomats are still untangling years later. Plot twist, the most immediate legal showdown is happening over those very shipping lanes. Canada's position that the Northwest Passage constitutes internal waters isn't just about sovereignty, it's about who bears responsibility when things go wrong. If a vessel spills oil in those narrow channels, Canada wants the authority to dictate the cleanup and hold the responsible party accountable. But here's where it gets complicated. If the passage is considered an international strait, the legal framework shifts dramatically, potentially limiting Canada's ability to enforce its environmental standards. This isn't an abstract debate, it's about who pays when a billion-dollar disaster happens in some of the world's most fragile ecosystems. Meanwhile, something else was happening that could change the entire legal landscape: the race to file extended continental shelf claims. Russia made the first dramatic move back in 2001, submitting documentation claiming nearly half the Arctic Ocean. But here's the crazy part. They planted a titanium flag on the seabed at the North Pole as a publicity stunt, which international lawyers largely dismissed as legally meaningless, but which perfectly illustrated their determination to assert control. Since then, Canada and Denmark have filed competing claims, with Denmark arguing that the Lomonosov Ridge, an underwater mountain range, is actually a geological extension of Greenland. These claims won't be resolved for years, maybe decades, but in the meantime, companies are already eyeing the resources in these disputed zones. But wait, there's more. The legal battles aren't just between nations, they're also between national governments and indigenous communities whose rights predate any of these modern claims. Through land claims agreements and international recognition of indigenous rights, groups like the Inuit Circumpolar Council are asserting their role in Arctic governance. Their traditional knowledge about ice conditions, wildlife patterns, and sustainable resource use is gaining legal weight just as the great powers are realizing they need local cooperation to operate effectively. This creates a fascinating three-dimensional chess game where national sovereignty, indigenous rights, and international law all intersect. Here's where the diplomatic dance gets really delicate. The Arctic Council, the main forum for Arctic cooperation, specifically excludes military security from its mandate. That means the most tense issues are discussed elsewhere, through bilateral channels or in military-to-military communications that lack the transparency of multilateral diplomacy. This separation creates a dangerous gap where commercial and environmental cooperation can proceed while military posturing continues in the background, with neither side fully understanding the other's red lines. The real genius of Russia's legal strategy has been their creation of facts on the water, while debates continue ashore. By establishing a system of icebreaker escorts, fees, and regulations for the Northern Sea route, they're effectively setting precedents that will be difficult to reverse later. Other nations can protest, but as more shipping companies comply with Russia's rules to ensure safe passage, those rules gradually become accepted practice. It's a masterclass in incremental norm setting that could eventually reshape the legal understanding of who controls Arctic shipping lanes. What makes this legal battlefield so dangerous is that different players are operating under completely different interpretations simultaneously. A Russian icebreaker captain sees himself as providing a necessary service in waters where Russia has regulatory authority. An American naval officer sees himself as asserting freedom of navigation in international waters. A Canadian patrol boat captain sees himself as defending sovereignty in domestic territory. When these perspectives collide in remote, harsh conditions, the results can escalate faster than any diplomat can respond. The law provides a framework for resolving disputes, but when everyone interprets that framework differently, the framework itself becomes a source of conflict rather than resolution. The emerging pattern suggests that Arctic law is being created not in courtrooms or treaty negotiations, but through the daily actions of ships, companies, and communities. Every transit, every drilling operation, every fishing voyage sets precedents that will shape the region's future governance. The nations that understand this are playing the long game, building their cases through persistent presence and incremental claims. The ones waiting for clear rules may find that by the time the rules are written, the game has already been decided through practice rather than principle. And in this new legal frontier, possession isn't just 9/10 of the law, it might be the only law that matters. UNCLOS and the Continental Shelf, mapping the disputed zones. Okay, so here's where the legal battle gets really interesting. You know that feeling when you're trying to split an inheritance with relatives who all have different copies of the will? That's essentially what's happening with the Arctic seabed right now, and the document everyone's fighting over is called UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. But here's the twist. This treaty was written before anyone imagined the ice would retreat this far, and now nations are stretching its definitions to claim territory that was once permanently frozen. Get this, UNCLOS allows countries to claim an exclusive economic zone extending 200 nautical miles from their coastlines. But here's where it gets crazy. If they can prove their continental shelf extends beyond that limit, they can claim seabed rights out to 350 nautical miles or even further under certain conditions. That's triggered a geological gold rush where nations are spending millions on underwater mapping expeditions, not to find resources, but to prove their rocks connect to distant seabeds. Russia claims the Lomonosov Ridge is an extension of Siberia. Canada says it's part of the North American plate. Denmark argues it actually connects to Greenland. Three nations, one underwater mountain range, and trillions of dollars in potential resources hanging in the balance. Meanwhile, something else was happening that makes this legal fight so urgent. The commission that reviews these claims, the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, has a backlog that stretches years into the future. But here's the plot twist. Nations can start exploring and even developing resources in these disputed zones while their claims are being evaluated. That creates a race where the first mover doesn't just gain economic advantage, they establish facts on the seabed that could influence the final decision. It's law meets realpolitik in some of the most remote waters on Earth. But wait, there's more. The mapping technology being used is straight out of science fiction. Autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with multi-beam sonar are charting seabeds with centimeter-level precision. Gravity measurements from satellites detect underwater mass concentrations that hint at geological connections. Seismic surveys fire sound waves through rock layers to build 3D models of the subsurface. This isn't just mapping, it's creating geological narratives that will determine who gets to drill where for decades to come. And the scientists conducting this research are essentially writing the legal briefs that will decide national boundaries. Here's where the story takes another turn. The United States finds itself in a particularly awkward position. While Russia, Canada, and Denmark are all filing detailed continental shelf claims based on UNCLOS, America hasn't ratified the treaty. They can participate in the scientific discussions, but they can't formally submit a claim or vote on others' submissions. This creates a situation where the world's foremost naval power is essentially watching from the sidelines as its Arctic neighbors carve up the seabed. Their only recourse is to challenge excessive claims through diplomatic protests and freedom of navigation operations, a much weaker position than having a seat at the table. The real genius of Russia's approach has been their combination of legal argument and physical presence. While their lawyers prepare elaborate geological submissions to the UN Commission, their icebreakers and research vessels are actively working in the disputed areas, collecting data that supports their claims and establishing operational patterns that reinforce their position. It's a classic case of possession is 9/10 of the law, playing out across thousands of square kilometers of seabed. Other nations can file paperwork, but Russia is filing paperwork while simultaneously operating in the territory they're claiming. But here's the thing that makes this legal battle so dangerous. Unlike land borders that are clearly marked and generally stable, these maritime boundaries are invisible, fluid, and based on interpretations of complex geological data. A slight difference in how you interpret seismic data could shift a boundary by dozens of kilometers, placing a potential oil field in one nation's territory instead of another's. And with climate change actively reshaping the coastline through erosion and sea level rise, even the starting points for measuring these zones are moving. We're trying to draw permanent lines on a map that's literally changing beneath our feet. What we're witnessing is the creation of Arctic law in real time, not through dramatic courtroom decisions, but through the patient accumulation of geological evidence, the gradual establishment of operational patterns, and the slow grind of diplomatic negotiation. The nations that understand this are playing the long game, recognizing that the rules of the new Arctic will be written by those who persistently demonstrate capability and presence. The ones treating this as a theoretical legal debate may find that by the time the judges rule, the game has already been won through sustained operation and strategic positioning. And in this new frontier, the most valuable territory isn't what you can see, it's what lies beneath the waves, waiting for the ice to retreat enough to reveal its secrets. The Arctic Council, a forum under strain. But here's where the diplomatic story takes a critical turn. While nations posture with icebreakers and file competing seabed claims, there's one place where they're still supposed to talk, the Arctic Council. Established in 1996, this unique forum brings together the 8 Arctic nations: the United States, Russia, Canada, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Sweden, and Finland, along with 6 indigenous permanent participant organizations. For decades, it's been the primary venue for cooperation on scientific research, environmental protection, and sustainable development. But here's the twist. The Council's founding documents explicitly exclude military security from its mandate. That created a safe space for dialogue on soft issues while the hard security questions festered elsewhere. Now, as the ice retreats and strategic competition intensifies, that separation is becoming a dangerous liability. Get this, the Arctic Council operates on consensus, meaning every member has veto power. That worked fine when the discussions were about polar bear conservation or oil spill response protocols. But plot twist, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the other 7 members made an unprecedented decision. They would continue the Council's work, but without Russian participation. They paused all meetings rather than allowing Moscow to block consensus on every issue. This temporary workaround kept some cooperation alive, but it revealed the Council's fundamental vulnerability. When geopolitical tensions spill over from other regions, the Arctic's cooperative framework can fracture overnight. The very mechanism designed to ensure fairness, consensus, became a weapon that could paralyze the entire institution. Meanwhile, something else was happening that the Council wasn't designed to handle: the blurring of lines between civilian and military activities. China's scientific research vessels mapping seabeds for both environmental and strategic purposes. Russia's icebreakers serving dual commercial and military logistics functions. America's freedom of navigation operations that are simultaneously naval exercises and political statements. These activities fall into gray areas that the Arctic Council's mandate deliberately avoids, creating a governance gap where the most potentially dangerous interactions occur outside any formal dialogue structure. The Council can discuss climate change's impact on indigenous communities, but it can't address the warships now patrolling those same communities' traditional waters. But wait, there's more. The Council's structure gives indigenous groups a voice through permanent participant status, which is revolutionary in international diplomacy. Organizations like the Inuit Circumpolar Council sit at the same table as national governments, contributing traditional knowledge that's often more current than satellite data when it comes to understanding rapid environmental changes. This inclusion was meant to ensure that the people who actually live in the Arctic aren't overlooked in policy decisions. But here's where it gets complicated. When great power competition intensifies, indigenous perspectives can get drowned out by national security concerns. A recommendation about protecting caribou migration routes doesn't carry the same weight as a discussion about missile defense systems, even if both affect the same landscape. The real strain on the Council comes from its success. Over the years, it's produced landmark agreements like the Arctic Search and Rescue Agreement and the Agreement on Cooperation on Marine Oil Pollution Preparedness and Response. These are practical frameworks that save lives and protect the environment. But here's the catch: they depend on continued cooperation and trust. When Russia conducts military exercises that complicate search and rescue coordination, or when NATO increases patrols that could be misinterpreted, the foundation of these agreements weakens. The Council has created a web of interdependence, but that web frays when members stop seeing each other as partners. What makes this particularly dangerous is the timing. The Arctic needs more governance, not less, as human activity increases. New shipping routes require updated navigation standards. Expanding resource extraction demands stronger environmental protections. Growing tourism needs better safety protocols. But with the Council partially paralyzed by geopolitical tensions, these issues aren't being addressed with the urgency they require. Instead, we're seeing more bilateral and minilateral arrangements. The United States working with Norway and Finland, Canada coordinating with Denmark, that create a patchwork of governance rather than a coherent regional framework. The Council's fundamental challenge is that it was designed for an Arctic that was frozen in both senses, physically icy and geopolitically stable. It assumed that the major powers would continue to see the region primarily as an environmental and scientific space rather than a strategic battleground. That assumption has been shattered by climate change and renewed great power competition. The forum that was meant to keep the peace now struggles to convene its members in the same room. And in the absence of formal dialogue, misunderstandings become more likely, red lines get tested unintentionally, and the delicate balance that has kept the Arctic peaceful for decades becomes increasingly precarious. The melting ice isn't just creating new shipping lanes, it's melting the very foundations of Arctic cooperation. The militarization of the Arctic, submarines, bases, and missiles. But here's where the story takes a decisive turn from commercial competition to something far more dangerous. While diplomats debate and companies calculate risks, the Arctic is witnessing a military buildup unlike anything since the Cold War. And it's not happening with dramatic declarations or public parades. It's occurring quietly, incrementally, beneath the waves and along frozen coastlines. The opening of the Arctic isn't just creating economic opportunities, it's resurrecting strategic calculations that were frozen for decades. Get this, the most significant military developments are happening where they're hardest to see, underwater. Nuclear-powered submarines from the United States, Russia, and increasingly the United Kingdom are conducting sophisticated under-ice operations that would have been nearly impossible a generation ago. These aren't just exercises, they're about securing the ultimate strategic advantage, the ability to hide nuclear deterrence where satellites can't see them and sonar struggles to penetrate. The complex underwater topography of the Arctic Basin, with its ridges and varying ice thickness, provides perfect hiding spots for ballistic missile submarines. For Russia, this represents the core of their Arctic Bastion concept, creating a sanctuary for their second strike capability that's protected by natural ice barriers and concentrated defensive systems. Meanwhile, something else was happening along Russia's Arctic coastline that most of the world missed. Dozens of Soviet-era bases that were abandoned after the Cold War are being reopened and modernized at a staggering pace. Places like Nagoskoye Air Base, just 1,000 kilometers from the North Pole, now feature extended runways capable of handling strategic bombers, advanced radar systems, and S-400 missile defense batteries. These installations aren't just symbolic, they create overlapping fields of surveillance and control that make Russia's Northern Sea route one of the most monitored waterways on Earth. The pattern is clear, each base supports the next, creating a defensive chain that stretches from the Kola Peninsula to the Bering Strait. But wait, there's more. Russia's Northern Fleet, based near Murmansk, is undergoing its most significant upgrade since the Soviet era. New specialized submarines like the Yasen class are designed specifically for Arctic operations, equipped with advanced sensors and weapons systems optimized for under-ice warfare. Their Bore-class ballistic missile submarines represent the core of Russia's nuclear deterrent, and the Arctic's complex underwater geography makes them incredibly difficult to detect and track. This isn't just about power projection, it's about survival in a potential conflict scenario. By controlling the underwater approaches to their strategic assets, Russia aims to create a scenario where challenging their Arctic presence becomes unacceptably risky. Plot twist, the United States' response has been necessarily asymmetric. While they can't match Russia's Icebreaker for Icebreaker or Base for Base, they're leveraging what they do have in abundance: submarine technology and surveillance capabilities. American attack submarines have been operating under the Arctic ice for decades, honing skills that few other nations can match. The recent deployment of Virginia-class submarines with enhanced under-ice capabilities signals a renewed commitment to maintaining underwater dominance. Meanwhile, increased P-8 Poseidon surveillance flights and investments in space-based monitoring systems aim to compensate for the lack of permanent surface presence. It's a classic case of quality versus quantity, with the US betting that technological superiority can overcome geographical disadvantage. Here's where the story takes another turn. NATO's approach has been complicated by the very different priorities of its member states. Norway, with its long Arctic coastline and direct border with Russia, views the region with urgent concern, and has invested heavily in new frigates and submarine capabilities. Canada focuses on sovereignty protection in the Northwest Passage with its new Arctic patrol vessels. Meanwhile, the accession of Finland and Sweden into NATO changes the calculus dramatically, bringing two additional nations with modern Arctic-capable militaries into the alliance. This creates both opportunity and challenge, more capability, but also more coordination complexity in a region where communication is difficult and response times are critical. The real danger isn't the military buildup itself, it's the lack of communication channels to manage incidents when they inevitably occur. Close encounters between military aircraft, shadowing of naval vessels, and underwater detection events are becoming more frequent in the increasingly crowded Arctic. Without the confidence-building measures and transparency that characterized Cold War interactions, these incidents carry greater risk of miscalculation. A submarine tracking another submarine under the ice operates with limited communication options and tremendous pressure to maintain stealth. An aircraft intercept in poor visibility conditions leaves little margin for error. These aren't theoretical risks, they're daily realities for the crews operating in this harsh environment. What makes this militarization particularly concerning is how it intersects with the commercial activity we discussed earlier. The same waters that host increasing shipping traffic are also becoming training grounds for submarine operations. The air corridors used by commercial flights are shared with strategic bombers on patrol. The infrastructure supporting resource extraction projects could become targets in a conflict scenario. This blending of civilian and military activities creates a volatile mix where an accident or misunderstanding could escalate rapidly, with consequences far beyond the Arctic itself. The very openness that creates economic opportunity also creates strategic vulnerability, a paradox that none of the Arctic powers have fully resolved. The emerging pattern suggests that the Arctic is becoming militarized by default rather than by design. As commercial activity increases, nations feel compelled to protect their interests. As strategic waterways open, naval presence follows. As resource extraction expands, security concerns grow. This isn't a coordinated arms race so much as a cascade of reactions to changing physical and geopolitical realities. But the effect is the same. More weapons, more surveillance, more potential flashpoints in a region that lacks the institutions to manage conflict. The ice may be melting, but the trust between Arctic powers is freezing over, and that's a combination that could have consequences far beyond the top of the world. Scenarios for conflict escalation. Okay, so here's where things get interesting. You know that feeling when you're watching a chess game and you suddenly realize the next move could checkmate the entire board? That's the point we've reached in the Arctic. All the pieces are in position, the icebreakers, the military bases, the resource claims, but the real danger isn't the pieces themselves. It's how they might interact when something unexpected happens. And in the Arctic, unexpected is becoming the new normal. Get this, the first flashpoint might not look like a traditional military confrontation at all. Imagine a scenario where a Russian-flagged LNG tanker suffers a mechanical failure in the middle of the Northwest Passage during a period of heightened tensions. Canadian authorities insist on leading the rescue operation, citing their sovereignty over what they consider internal waters. But here's the twist. The tanker's insurance company demands a Russian icebreaker for the salvage operation, citing contractual obligations. Suddenly, you have Russian military assets operating in waters Canada claims as its own, with both sides believing they have legal justification. This isn't about who fires first, it's about who blinks when jurisdiction gets murky. Meanwhile, something else was happening that makes these scenarios even more dangerous: the commercialization of dual-use technology. A Chinese research vessel mapping seabed resources might accidentally snag an underwater communications cable while collecting samples. The cable just happens to carry data between early warning radar stations in Alaska and command centers in Colorado. The incident gets classified as an accident, but the timing coincides with military exercises on both sides. In the fog of peace, intentions become impossible to read, and defensive postures look like preparations for attack. But wait, there's more. The fishing disputes we discussed earlier could escalate faster than anyone anticipates. A Norwegian Coast Guard vessel intercepts an Icelandic trawler operating in what Norway claims as its exclusive economic zone, but the trawler is actually under charter to a Russian company. The captain refuses to leave, citing a bilateral fishing agreement from the 1970s that Norway claims is obsolete. As the standoff continues, a Russian fishery protection vessel arrives to support the trawler, creating a face-off between two NATO allies and a resurgent Russia. What begins as a fisheries enforcement issue becomes a sovereignty test with strategic implications. Plot twist: the most dangerous scenario might involve commercial actors who don't even realize they're triggering geopolitical crises. A private mining company begins exploratory drilling in an area where seabed claims overlap between Russia and Norway. They've obtained permits from the Norwegian government, but Russian authorities claim the activity violates their continental shelf rights. When a Russian naval vessel arrives to inspect the drilling platform, the company calls its home country's embassy for protection. Suddenly, a corporate investment decision becomes an international incident with no clear off-ramp. Here's where it gets really tense. The Arctic's extreme environment acts as both a deterrent and an accelerant. Harsh conditions force quick decisions with limited information. Communication blackouts during solar storms or equipment failures in extreme cold can leave isolated units making judgment calls without higher guidance. A submarine commander tracking another sub under the ice has seconds to decide whether a sonar contact is a threat or a false echo. An aircraft pilot intercepting an unidentified drone in whiteout conditions has minimal margin for error. The very factors that make the Arctic strategically valuable also make it dangerously unpredictable. But here's the thing that keeps military planners up at night. The escalation ladder in the Arctic has missing rungs. Traditional conflict de-escalation measures, hotlines, confidence-building meetings, observation protocols don't exist in the same robust form they did during the Cold War. A close encounter between patrol vessels that would have been managed through established channels in the Baltic Sea becomes a crisis with no playbook in the Bering Strait. The rules of engagement are being written in real time, often by junior officers operating far from oversight. Now remember, climate change itself is the wild card in all these scenarios. An unusually severe ice year could trap commercial vessels that ventured north based on optimistic forecasts, requiring international rescue efforts that force cooperation between rivals. Or a sudden Polinia, an area of open water surrounded by ice, could create unexpected access to strategically sensitive areas, tempting nations to test boundaries while the window remains open. The environment isn't just the stage for these dramas, it's an active participant that can rewrite the script without warning. What makes these scenarios so plausible isn't that nations want conflict, it's that the systems designed to prevent conflict are struggling to keep pace with the physical and geopolitical changes. The maps are outdated, the communication protocols are inadequate, and the legal frameworks are ambiguous. Into this gap rush not just warships and resource companies, but the very real possibility that a minor incident could spiral into a major confrontation before diplomats even know it's happening. The fuse isn't just lit, it's getting shorter with each passing season. Scenario 1. The resource extraction flashpoint. The real trigger might not be a warship crossing a line, but a corporate decision made in a boardroom thousands of miles from the ice. Picture this: a Norwegian energy company, backed by European investors, gets final approval to drill in the Barents Sea. Their permit is perfectly legal under Norwegian law. But here's where it gets complicated. The chosen site sits in a grey zone where Russia's claimed continental shelf overlaps with Norway's exclusive economic zone. For years, this ambiguity didn't matter because the ice made drilling impossible. Now, with the sea ice retreating, the company moves a state-of-the-art drilling platform into position. Meanwhile, something else was happening that the corporate planners didn't fully appreciate. A Russian geological survey vessel had been mapping the same seabed for months, collecting data to support Moscow's extended continental shelf claim at the UN. When the Norwegian platform arrives, the Russian ship doesn't leave. Instead, it positions itself a few kilometers away, flying a flag that designates it as a research vessel, but equipped with sonar that can monitor every detail of the drilling operation. The standoff isn't hostile yet, but it creates a situation where an accidental spill, equipment failure, or even a misunderstanding about safety zones could force both sides to escalate. The problem isn't just about who owns the oil, it's about precedent. If Norway successfully extracts resources from a disputed zone, it strengthens their legal position for future claims. Russia can't afford to let that happen, but they also can't afford to openly attack a commercial operation backed by NATO members. So they apply pressure subtly, increasing military flights near the platform, conducting safety inspections of supply vessels, and filing diplomatic protests that stop just short of threats. The company's insurers get nervous. Their premium rates spike. Workers on the platform start counting the days until their rotation ends. But here's where the scenario gets truly dangerous. The platform isn't operating in isolation. It's part of a network. Supply ships shuttle between it and the Norwegian coast. Helicopters transport personnel. Underwater pipelines are being laid to connect to existing infrastructure. Each of these connections represents a potential point of friction. A supply vessel taking a shortcut through what Russia considers its territorial waters. A helicopter flight that strays too close to a Russian military exercise. The lines between commercial activity and strategic provocation blur until nobody's sure where the boundaries actually lie. What makes this flashpoint different from traditional resource conflicts is the environmental stakes. The Barents Sea is one of the most productive fishing grounds on the planet, supporting livelihoods in both Norway and Russia. An oil spill here wouldn't just be an economic disaster, it would be an ecological catastrophe that could poison the region for generations. Both nations know this. Both have contingency plans. But in the event of an actual spill, would those plans work together or at cross purposes? The answer could determine whether a corporate accident becomes an international crisis. The real trigger might come from an unexpected direction. Imagine a group of climate activists deciding to take direct action against the platform. They sail a protest vessel into the safety zone, attempting to disrupt operations. The Norwegian Coast Guard moves to intercept them, but rough seas complicate the operation. Meanwhile, a Russian patrol boat observes the situation, interpreting the activists' presence as a potential pretext for sabotage. In the confusion of a stormy Arctic night, a collision occurs. The activists claim the Russian vessel rammed them intentionally. The Russians claim the activists were maneuvering dangerously. The company suspends operations, citing security concerns. And suddenly, a protest about climate change becomes a geopolitical incident with no clear way out. This scenario isn't about armies mobilizing or missiles launching. It's about the gradual accumulation of risk until the system reaches a breaking point. Each near miss, each diplomatic protest, each insurance premium increase adds another layer of tension. The companies involved just want to extract resources. The governments involved want to protect their interests. The activists want to save the planet. But in the harsh, remote environment of the Arctic, these competing priorities create a perfect storm where a single mistake could cascade into a confrontation that nobody wants, but everyone feels compelled to win. The resource extraction flashpoint demonstrates the fundamental paradox of the new Arctic. The same melting that creates economic opportunity also creates strategic vulnerability. Nations are racing to secure resources that become accessible only because the climate is changing in ways that make extracting those resources increasingly dangerous. It's a feedback loop where economic ambition and environmental risk amplify each other, creating conditions where a corporate decision made in Oslo or Moscow could trigger a chain reaction that reaches far beyond the ice. Scenario 2, the shipping lane blockade. Okay, so here's where things get really tense. While resource disputes simmer, the real powder keg might be the very shipping lanes that are supposed to bring the Arctic nations closer together through trade. Picture this. It's late September, and an unusually warm autumn has kept the Northern Sea route open longer than anyone predicted. A convoy of over 24 commercial vessels, container ships, LNG tankers, bulk carriers, is making a final push to transit from Asia to Europe before the winter ice closes in. They're all sailing under Russian escort, paying premium fees for the privilege. But here's the twist. A sudden, severe storm system moves in, pushing thick multi-year ice into the main shipping channel. The lead Russian icebreaker struggles to clear a path, and progress slows to a crawl. Meanwhile, something else was happening that the convoy captains didn't know about. A diplomatic crisis was unfolding between Russia and a Western nation over an unrelated issue thousands of miles away. In response, Moscow decides to flex its Arctic muscles. They declare the Northern Sea route temporarily closed due to extreme ice conditions and safety concerns. But here's the crazy part. Satellite imagery shows the ice situation is challenging but manageable. The real reason for the closure becomes apparent when Russian naval vessels arrive not to assist, but to enforce the blockade. Dozens of ships from multiple nations suddenly find themselves trapped between advancing ice and Russian warships. Their cargoes of perishable goods, time-sensitive manufacturing components, and winter energy supplies growing more valuable and more vulnerable by the hour. The problem escalates quickly. Insurance companies refuse to cover losses from what they're now calling a political risk event. Ship owners demand their governments intervene. NATO nations whose flagged vessels are trapped face an impossible choice: accept Russia's authority over what they consider international waters, or challenge a blockade in remote, hostile conditions where Russia holds all the tactical advantages. Each day of delay costs millions in spoiled cargo, missed delivery deadlines, and contractual penalties. The economic pressure to act becomes overwhelming, but the military risks are terrifying. But wait, there's more. The blockade creates a domino effect across global supply chains. European factories, depending on components from Asia, face shutdowns. Energy markets panic as LNG shipments crucial for winter heating are delayed. The Suez and Panama canals experience sudden congestion as rerouted traffic overwhelms their capacity. The incident demonstrates something terrifying to every trading nation. A single decision in Moscow can strangle a vital artery of global commerce, and there's very little anyone can do about it quickly. Here's where the scenario gets even more dangerous. A Chinese container ship, part of the trapped convoy, decides to test the blockade. Its captain calculates that the ice conditions are passable with their ice class rating and decides to proceed without Russian permission. The vessel slowly maneuvers around the stationary convoy, heading for what appears to be a navigable lead in the ice. Russian authorities issue increasingly stern warnings over the radio. Then, a Russian Coast Guard vessel moves to intercept. What happens next? A collision, a warning shot, a boarding attempt could trigger an international incident that draws in Beijing, Moscow, and every NATO member with ships in the convoy. The real danger of this scenario isn't just the immediate confrontation, it's the precedent it sets. If Russia successfully controls traffic through a claimed safety closure, they establish a powerful new tool of economic coercion. Future disagreements over Ukraine, sanctions, or any other issue could see the Northern Sea route weaponized as a pressure point. Other nations would feel compelled to respond, potentially by challenging future closures with naval escorts of their own. The shipping lane that was supposed to bring economic integration becomes a permanent source of geopolitical leverage. Meanwhile, the human cost mounts aboard the trapped vessels. Crews face extended deployments in brutal conditions. Food and fuel supplies dwindle. Morale plummets as sailors watch the temperature drop and the ice thicken around their ships. The psychological pressure on captains to make risky decisions grows with each passing day. Some vessels might attempt dangerous maneuvers to escape, risking environmental disaster in these fragile waters. The very safety concerns Russia cited for the closure could become a self-fulfilling prophecy as desperation sets in. What makes this blockade scenario so plausible is that it doesn't require direct military conflict to be effective. Russia can justify its actions under international maritime law provisions, allowing for temporary closures due to genuine safety hazards. The ambiguity between legitimate safety concern and strategic power play creates perfect cover. Western nations would struggle to mount a legal challenge while appearing to disregard seafarer safety. The moral high ground becomes a tactical trap. The aftermath of such an incident would reshape Arctic governance forever. Shipping companies would demand military guarantees for future transits, blurring the line between commercial and military presence. Insurance markets would fundamentally repricing Arctic routes, potentially making them unviable for all but the most essential cargoes. The dream of the Arctic as a new global commons would shatter, replaced by a reality where every transit requires calculating not just ice conditions, but political risk. This scenario reveals the fundamental vulnerability of relying on routes controlled by a single nation. The Northern Sea route isn't like the Suez or Panama canals, neutral choke points with international oversight. It's a strategic asset entirely within one country's sphere of influence. When that country decides to use that asset as leverage, the world discovers it has very few good options. The shipping lanes that promised to bring nations closer together through trade could instead become the fault lines where economic interdependence becomes strategic vulnerability. And in the high-stakes game of Arctic geopolitics, controlling the map might ultimately matter more than following its rules. Scenario 3: Miscalculation and proxy conflicts. But here's where the story takes its most dangerous turn. The scenario that keeps intelligence analysts up at night isn't a deliberate attack, but a cascade of misunderstandings in an environment where communication is difficult and trust is non-existent. Picture this: a joint Russian-Chinese naval exercise is underway in the Barents Sea, a routine event on the calendar, but one that NATO is monitoring closely given current tensions. Meanwhile, a Norwegian research vessel is collecting oceanographic data nearby, its movements coordinated with allied commands. But here's the twist: unusually intense solar activity is disrupting GPS signals and satellite communications across the high latitudes. In the electronic fog, the Russian radar operator tracking the Norwegian vessel sees its course change abruptly, not because of any hostile intent, but because the captain is manually navigating around a newly reported iceberg. From the Russian perspective, the maneuver looks like the beginning of an intelligence-gathering run toward their exercise area. Meanwhile, something else was happening that nobody on the bridge could see. A British attack submarine, operating under strict radio silence as part of a separate NATO exercise, is tracking the Russian flotilla from below. Its mission is purely observational, but its presence is unknown to the surface ships. When the Russian anti-submarine warfare helicopter detects an underwater contact that doesn't match any known friendly vessel, the situation escalates rapidly. The helicopter drops sonarbuoys, the submarine goes quiet, and suddenly both sides are operating on worst-case assumptions with limited information. But wait, there's more. The communication breakdown extends to the diplomatic level. A scheduled hotline test between the Russian Northern Fleet and NATO's Arctic Command is postponed due to the solar storm, meaning the backup channels aren't verified. When the Norwegian captain tries to radio his intentions, his transmission is garbled by atmospheric interference. The Russian exercise commander, already wary of Western surveillance, interprets the combination of events as a coordinated provocation. He orders his ships to defensive positions and alerts higher command that they may be facing an intelligence operation disguised as scientific research. Here's where the proxy element enters the equation. The research vessel is Norwegian, but its funding comes from an EU climate science program, and its equipment includes sensors provided by the United States. The Russian analysis concludes this isn't just a scientific mission, it's a NATO front operation testing their defenses. They decide to respond proportionally but firmly, sending a border patrol vessel to escort the research ship away from the exercise area. But the Norwegian captain, following his orders and concerned about losing valuable data, refuses to alter course. The standoff escalates from misunderstanding to confrontation. Plot twist: the real danger emerges from the commercial sector. An LNG tanker owned by a Japanese company but chartered by a French energy firm is transiting the area en route to Europe. Its captain, seeing the naval activity on radar and receiving fragmented warnings over emergency channels, decides to divert course sharply to avoid potential danger. This unexpected maneuver places the massive vessel directly between the Russian patrol boat and the Norwegian research ship during a critical moment. The Russian captain, already operating under stress, interprets this as a deliberate blocking action, a commercial vessel being used as a shield for military intelligence gathering. What nobody anticipates is how quickly the incident becomes a test of national prestige. Social media posts from crew members aboard the various vessels begin circulating fragmented accounts of the encounter. Russian state media portrays it as NATO aggression in Russia's backyard. Western outlets describe it as Russian harassment of legitimate scientific activity. The narrative hardens before the facts can be established. Diplomats trying to de-escalate find their efforts undermined by the public perception battle raging thousands of miles from the actual incident. But here's the thing that makes this scenario so plausible: it doesn't require any party to want conflict. The Norwegian scientists just want to complete their research. The Russian naval officers are following standard procedures for protecting military exercises. The commercial captain is making safety decisions based on incomplete information. The British submarine commander is adhering to his mission parameters. Each actor is making rational decisions based on their limited perspective, but those decisions are interacting in unpredictable ways in an environment where the rules are unclear and communication is compromised. The resolution, or escalation, depends on factors nobody controls. If the solar storm abates and communications are restored, cooler heads might prevail. If the weather worsens and visibility drops further, the risk of accidental collision increases dramatically. If political leaders back home feel pressured to demonstrate resolve to domestic audiences, they might issue ultimatums that narrow the options for on-scene commanders. The incident becomes a race between technology, restoring clarity, and politics, amplifying confusion. This scenario reveals the fundamental vulnerability of the new Arctic. It's becoming increasingly crowded with actors who don't share common procedures, communication protocols, or even basic trust. Military exercises, scientific research, commercial shipping, and resource extraction are all happening in the same spaces with inadequate coordination. The systems designed to prevent accidents, like the incidents at sea agreement between the US and Russia, haven't been updated for these new realities. The result is an environment where a simple miscommunication could trigger a chain reaction that leads to confrontation before anyone fully understands what's happening. The real lesson of the miscalculation scenario isn't that any nation wants war in the Arctic. It's that war could find them anyway, emerging from the interaction of complex systems under stress. As the ice retreats and human activity increases, the probability of these dangerous interactions grows exponentially. The Arctic isn't just becoming more accessible, it's becoming more interconnected in ways that create new vulnerabilities, even as it creates new opportunities. And in this hyperconnected but underregulated environment, the distance between peace and conflict may be shorter than anyone realizes. The Arctic paradox and the future of global stability. That single moment, when a research vessel's course change is misinterpreted as aggression, reveals the core paradox of the new Arctic. The same openness that creates economic opportunity also creates strategic vulnerability. The shipping lanes that promise to connect continents could become the fault lines that divide them. The resources that could fuel prosperity might instead fund confrontation. And the ice that once kept nations apart is now melting so fast that it's outpacing our ability to build the institutions needed to keep them from colliding. The real race isn't between superpowers, it's between the pace of environmental change and the pace of diplomatic adaptation. Right now, the ice is winning. While nations posture with icebreakers and file competing seabed claims, the fundamental rules of engagement in the Arctic remain dangerously ambiguous. We're trying to manage 21st century challenges with 20th century institutions, and the gap between what's needed and what exists widens with each passing season. What happens next in the Arctic won't stay in the Arctic. The decisions made in these remote waters will ripple through global supply chains, energy markets, and security architectures. A conflict here wouldn't be contained by geography, it would travel through the interconnected systems that sustain modern life. The fuse is burning, but it's not too late to build the fire breaks. The question is whether we'll recognize the urgency before the spark finds the tinder. If you want to understand how underwater internet cables are becoming the next frontier in this silent conflict, Watch our investigation into the digital Cold War brewing beneath the waves. Subscribe for more stories about the hidden geography that shapes our world.